I have been drawing coastlines for 11 years. Not metaphorically. I mean, I sit at a drafting table or in front of a photogrammetry workstation, and I reconcile what instruments say about a piece of land with what that land actually is. Its gradients, its erosion patterns, its vegetation boundary shifts, its infrastructure deposition. I work for a geospatial survey firm contracted by federal emergency management bodies across 4 countries. My job is to go somewhere, measure it with precision, and produce a document that tells other people what is true about that place. Everything I do is verifiable. Everything I produce is signed. My name is Daravas. I am 38 years old. I have a daughter named Petra who is 9 and lives with her father in Linz. I mention this not because it becomes important later in the way that personal details become important in stories, where the writer wants you to feel the full weight of what was lost. I mention it because it is the thing I was thinking about on the morning I flew into Svalbard, and because the distance between myself and Petra is the one variable in my life I have never been able to accurately measure. The assignment was described to us as post-disaster terrain reconciliation. A coal mining settlement on the eastern coast of Spitsbergen, operational through the mid-20th century, had experienced a series of structural collapses over the preceding winter. The Norwegian Directorate of Mining had flagged the site for a full geospatial audit before issuing formal decommissioning paperwork. There were 4 of us, myself as lead surveyor, a geotechnical specialist named Roald who had worked Svalbard 3 times before, a junior cartographer named Signa who was on her 2nd field deployment, and a man called Edvard who was nominally our logistics coordinator but who carried a set of satellite communications equipment I was not formally introduced to and never asked about. We landed at Longyearbyen and drove east in 2 vehicles. The settlement was called Kalver. It did not appear in current administrative records. Roald said this was normal for legacy sites. They got absorbed into regional categories. Their individual designations dissolved. I accepted this. I had worked 3 sites in the preceding 2 years that had no current designation. It is not unusual for places to be administratively erased while remaining physically present. The road ended 4 kilometers short of the settlement. We continued on foot across ground that was permafrost solid and snow-patched in late April, carrying equipment in modular cases rated for the temperature. The sky was the color of old bone. The wind was low and consistent from the north-northeast. I noted these things because I note everything. It is not anxiety. It is the habit of a person whose professional value is precision. Kalver came into view as a collection of dark rectangular shapes against the gray hillside. Standard Arctic industrial settlement layout, main housing block, auxiliary structures, a processing facility set back from the others. There was a coal loading infrastructure that descended toward a small harbor where the ice had not fully broken. Everything looked consistent with a site that had been inactive for decades. Oxidized metal. Sagging roof sections. Snow accumulated in geometric drifts against structural angles. Nothing moved. The first thing I noticed was the path. Not a path in the dramatic sense. A series of impressions in the snow between the main housing block and what I identified on the preliminary maps as a communal utility structure. The impressions were boot-shaped, recent enough that wind had not softened their edges. I stopped walking and looked at them for several seconds without saying anything. Roald was ahead of me, already opening his ground-penetrating radar case. Signa was adjusting her camera-mounting harness. I looked at the prints, and then I looked at the housing block, and then I continued walking. In this work, you learn not to narrate what you see until you know what you are looking at. Unexplained impressions in snow at an abandoned site have multiple explanations. Wildlife inspection teams, a prior survey visit not communicated in the briefing, maintenance contractors performing basic structural assessment. I catalogued the observation and moved on. We set up our base equipment inside the processing facility, which had 3 walls fully intact and a partial roof. The 4th wall had collapsed inward. This was consistent with the Mining Directorate's reported structural event. Edvard established his communications array in the northeast corner with a speed that suggested prior familiarity with the process. I did not comment on this. He was not under my direction. Roald ran initial ground-penetrating passes along the main housing block's foundation perimeter. I began the photogrammetry sequence, walking systematic transects across the site's primary structures with the scanner unit. Culver had housed approximately 40 workers at peak operation. The records the Directorate had provided listed a formal closure date of 1962. Standard closure. Extraction became economically non-viable. Personnel withdrawn. Equipment mothballed. The site had been subject to 3 prior surveys, all geological, none geospatial. My job was to produce a precise spatial record of the current state of the structures for decommissioning documentation. By the end of the first afternoon, I had scanned the processing facility, 2 of the auxiliary structures, and the exterior of the housing block. The data was clean. The structures were where the preliminary maps said they were. The collapse geometry was consistent with the Directorate's description. Everything was procedurally normal. I found the heating register on my way back through the processing facility at approximately 1640. It was a standard cast iron radiator unit, wall-mounted, connected to what should have been a long-dead central heating loop. I was walking past it. I stopped. I put my hand on it. It was warm. Not residually warm. Not sun-warmed, because there had been no direct sun on this face of the building all day. Warm in the way a radiator is warm when hot water is moving through it. I held my hand there for a measured 10 seconds. The warmth was consistent and did not diminish. I removed my hand. I looked at the unit. I looked at the pipe running from its base into the floor. I took 3 photographs with precise metadata timestamps. Then I went to find Roald. He was still outside. I told him what I had found. He came back in and put his hand on the radiator and held it there. He did not say anything for a moment. "Geothermal bleed," he said. "It happens. Residual heat in the pipe mass from the original system. These old cast iron installations hold temperature for decades if they're sealed correctly." I asked him if he had seen it before. He said he had heard of it. I wrote it down in my field notes with the exact temperature I had estimated, the duration of my contact, the time, and the ambient air temperature, which was -4. I noted Rold's explanation and flagged the observation as requiring verification. That night we slept in the vehicle bay of the processing facility in cold-rated sleeping equipment. The temperature dropped to -11. I lay awake for some time doing what I do when I cannot sleep, which is run mental transects of the day's observations and check them for internal consistency. The path of boot impressions. The warm radiator. Edvard's communications array, which I had noticed was connected to a directional antenna I could not identify as standard emergency management equipment. I decided none of these things were individually alarming. I decided to continue the survey. The second day began with a discovery that changed the internal logic of the site in a way I could not resolve with professional explanations. I was completing photogrammetry transects of the housing block interior. The building had 6 residential rooms, a common room, a cooking facility, and a washroom. The rooms were as expected: remnant furniture, collapsed or absent personal effects, the specific quality of degraded softness that spaces acquire when they have been uninhabited for very long periods. Decades of dust. Oxidized metal. Textile matter that had lost all structural integrity. The cooking facility was different. The surfaces were clean. Not sterile. Not recently scrubbed. But clean in the sense of maintained, free of the layered particulate accumulation that covered every other surface in the building. The iron range had been used within a period I could not precisely determine, but which my professional experience of material degradation placed as no more than several months. The residue pattern inside the burner chambers was inconsistent with 60 years of dormancy. There was a cup on the counter. It was ceramic intact, and the interior showed a dried ring consistent with a beverage that had evaporated rather than been left for decades. I photographed everything. I measured the residue deposits in 3 burner chambers and recorded the estimates. I photographed the cup from 4 angles with a reference scale. I did not touch anything else. When I came out, Signa was running her photogrammetry transects along the eastern housing block wall. I asked her if she had been inside the cooking facility. She said she had done a walk through the previous evening for preliminary orientation and had noted nothing unusual. I asked her about the cup. She looked at me. What cup? I brought her inside and showed her. She stood in front of the range for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "That wasn't there yesterday." She was certain. She had a precise visual memory for field environments. I had noted this quality in her on a previous deployment, and it was one of the reasons I had requested her for this assignment. If she said the cup had not been there, I believed her. Someone had placed it there between the previous evening and this morning. I went to find Edvard. He was in the northeast corner with his communications equipment, running what appeared to be a signal calibration. I asked him directly whether anyone else had been briefed into this site. He looked at me with the particular flatness of a person deciding how much to say. "The site may have had prior activity," he said. "It's in the briefing addendum." I told him I had not received a briefing addendum. He said he would check with the directorate. I returned to the cooking facility and stood in it for several minutes. The warmth that was absent everywhere else in the building was faintly present here. not the acute warmth of the radiator, a residual quality, as if the room had recently held body heat. I wrote this in my field notes and did not tell Roald or Signa. That afternoon Roald's ground-penetrating radar produced a result that restructured my understanding of the site's physical geography. He called me over to his workstation with no particular urgency. He had a habit of displaying minimal reaction to significant findings, which I had initially read as composure and had gradually come to understand as something more deliberate. He showed me the GPR composite for the foundation zone of the housing block. There was a subsurface structure directly beneath the building that the preliminary maps had not indicated. It was large, Roald estimated 15 by 20 meters based on the reflection geometry, and at a depth of approximately 4 meters. Its profile was consistent with a sealed chamber. The walls showed a material density inconsistent with natural rock formation. "That's constructed," I said. "Yes," he said. "It's not on any of the documentation." "No," he said. I asked him how old it appeared based on the disturbed strata profile. He was quiet for a moment. The surrounding strata suggests it was installed at roughly the same period as the surface structures. Mid-20th century, consistent with the operational period. "Does it look sealed?" He zoomed in on the reflection profile. There was a section along the eastern wall of the subsurface chamber where the material density was interrupted. "There's an access point," he said. "That section there. The material profile is different, lighter, more recent insertion. The aperture would be approximately 80 centimeters. I asked him when the insertion had been made. He said he couldn't determine that from GPR alone. I asked him what his best professional estimate was. He said, "Not 60 years ago." I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I asked him what was in the chamber. He said the interior reflections were complex. There was mass present, multiple objects of varying density arranged in a pattern he could not interpret from the surface data. We went inside together and found the access point in the floor of the cooking facility. It was beneath a section of the iron range that had been designed, I now understood, to be moved. The range was not fixed to the wall. It rolled on casters that had been kept clean and functional. The floor section beneath revealed a hatch, approximately 80 centimeters square, with a pull handle that had no rust on it. I looked at Roald. He looked at me. I opened it. The ladder below was metal, and the rungs had been wiped down. The air that came up was not the dead air of a sealed space. It moved. It was warmer than the room above. We descended. The chamber was lit by a series of battery-powered strip lights attached to the ceiling at regular intervals, the kind used in field medical installations, rated for extended autonomous operation. They were on. Not flickering, not dimming. On, at full brightness, drawing from a power source I could not immediately locate. The chamber was divided into sections by partition walls that had been constructed at a later date than the main chamber structure, newer material, more careful joinery. The first section contained storage, provisions, sealed and vacuum packaging, stacked on metal shelving. The packaging was modern. The labeling was in Norwegian. The expiry dates on the packaging visible to me ranged from 16 to 31 months in the future. I stood in front of those shelves for a long time. Someone had stocked this place recently. Not as an emergency cache. The quantity and variety were consistent with extended occupancy provisioning. I began counting units and stopped myself. The count was not the point. The point was the date range on the packaging, which meant someone had been here within the last year and planned to return, or planned to remain. The second section held the thing that shifted the assignment from anomalous to something I did not yet have a word for. It contained medical equipment. Not emergency first aid. A clinical installation, an examination table, a monitoring unit showing a standby display with 3 flatline channels ready to activate, for infrastructure, pharmaceutical storage in a refrigerated cabinet that was running. I could hear the compressor, at 4 degrees. I opened the pharmaceutical cabinet. The contents were organized and labeled. I did not touch anything. I photographed everything in sequence. When I had finished photographing, I stood back and looked at the whole space, and I recognized the layout. I had been in field medical installations before, on disaster response contracts. This was not configured for emergency treatment. It was configured for long-term care. Roald was behind me. I turned to look at him. His expression was careful and empty. "You've seen this before," I said. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "I've seen something like it." "Where?" "A different site. A different contract." I asked him who had sent him on that contract. He said, "The same directorate." I climbed back up the ladder and went directly to Edvard. I did not give him the opportunity to manage the conversation. I showed him the photographs on my camera display, the provisions, the medical installation, the pharmaceutical cabinet, and I asked him to tell me what this site actually was. He looked at the photographs for a long time. His communications equipment was running a low continuous tone behind him. "Culver was officially closed in 1962, he said. "That's accurate. But it didn't stop being used." He was quiet. "Edvard, there is a functioning medical installation under this building. There are provisions dated for the next 2.5 years. Someone placed a cup on a counter in the cooking facility between yesterday evening and this morning. I need you to tell me what is happening at this site." He said, "I need to make a call." I told him he had 2 hours. I went back to the main space and sat with my field notes and tried to build a coherent operational picture from what I had. The site had been officially decommissioned in 1962. The subsurface chamber had been constructed during the operational period, Roald's estimate, but had been actively maintained and resupplied in the period since. The medical installation was configured for long-term care of an unspecified number of patients. Someone was currently using the surface cooking facility. The boot impressions on arrival suggested at least one person had moved between the housing block and utility structure recently. I wrote all of this down. Then I wrote, underneath it, "Who is being cared for here? And who is doing the caring?" And then, because I am a person who cannot stop thinking precisely even when I would benefit from stopping, how long has this been running? Because the structure of the chamber, Rold's estimate of its construction date, the preliminary survey records going back to 3 geological assessments in 1974, 1991, and 2009, none of which had mentioned a subsurface chamber, suggested a deliberate and sustained program of concealment stretching back to the site's official closure. Over 60 years. Maintained through 3 prior survey visits by teams who had apparently not found it, or had found it and not reported it. I sat with that. 60 years is not an accident. 60 years is a decision made repeatedly, by multiple people, across generations of institutional management. Edvard came back in 1 hour and 40 minutes and told me the following. Culver had been used as a long-term residential care facility for a population he described only as individuals subject to a classified welfare program administered through the Directorate of Mining in conjunction with a federal health authority. The program had been established in the late 1950s, prior to the official closure. The closure had been partly administrative cover for the transition. The surface structures had been maintained in a state of apparent abandonment to support the classification. The actual population of the subsurface facility varied, but had never exceeded 12 individuals. The current occupancy was 4. I asked him why the Directorate of Mining. He said it had been the administering body for the region and had the existing infrastructure and classification authority. I asked him what the individuals subject to the program were being treated for. He said, "I don't have that information." I asked him who was currently providing care. He said there was a rotating care team. 2 individuals currently on site. They had been made aware of our survey team's presence and had been instructed to avoid contact. I said, "Someone was in the cooking facility this morning." He said there had likely been a scheduling error. I asked him what our assignment actually was. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The structural collapse over winter damaged the ventilation infrastructure for the subsurface facility. The current care team has been managing with supplementary portable units. The Directorate needs the surface structure geospatially documented for a potential remediation project, a structural reinforcement program that would address the ventilation issue. The survey is genuine. The documentation will be used exactly as described. But you didn't tell us what we were surveying. The program is classified." Edvard. I kept my voice level. It is not hard for me to keep my voice level. I have been trained, professionally and by circumstance, to maintain surface composure when my interior state is the opposite of composed. There are 4 people living underneath this building. They have been living in a facility administered through an institution whose public record says nothing about them. They have been here in some configuration of this program since the late 1950s. He said, "The program participants are here voluntarily, or were, at admission. The legal framework governing long-term voluntary welfare placement allows for continued residential status under classified welfare provisions. The people currently down there. Are any of them original participants?" He looked at me. "Edvard. The program started in the late 1950s. That is 65 years ago. I am asking you whether any of the 4 people currently in that facility were admitted in or around 1959 or 1960. He said, I don't have demographic information on current participants. I went back down the ladder. The 3rd section of the chamber, which I had not reached on the first ascent, was residential. 4 rooms, each approximately 3 meters by 3. Each room contained a bed, a small table, a lamp. Each room had personal effects, books in varying states of wear, small objects of the type people keep for reasons that are private and non-functional, clothing folded on shelves. The clothing told me the most. In 3 of the rooms, the clothing was in sizes and styles consistent with contemporary procurement, items I could imagine being ordered from a supply catalog within the last few years. The 4th room was different. The books on the shelf were old. Not decoratively old, functionally old, the kind of worn that comes from repeated reading across years. The spines were cracked in the specific places where a reader's hands return habitually. The titles were in Norwegian, printed in a typographic style consistent with mid-20th century publication. One was dated, in the edition information I photographed, 1957. The clothing on the shelf was old. Not damaged, laundered, folded, cared for. But the fabric weight, the cut, the fastening hardware, I have done enough historical site work to recognize mid-century manufacture when I am looking at it. Someone had maintained these clothes, washed them, folded them for decades. On the table there was a framed photograph. I picked it up. I should not have picked it up. I did it because the image registered before my professional discipline caught up with my instinct. It was a group photograph. 8 people outdoors, in front of what I recognized as the housing block above me. I could see the roofline geometry in the background. The clothing dated the photograph. Late 1950s, early 1960s. The people were smiling in the cautious way people smile in formal group photographs. They were young. Early to mid-20s, most of them. In the corner of the photograph, in pencil, someone had written 8 names and a date. The date was 1961. I put the photograph down exactly where I had found it. I took a single photograph of it with my camera, full resolution. Then I stood in that small room and I thought about Petra, which I did not intend to do and which I did not understand the logic of until later. Petra had been 3 when her father and I separated. She has photographs from before that age that she keeps in her room. I have seen them on video calls, arranged on her shelf. She cannot remember the periods those photographs depict. She keeps them anyway. She is building a version of her own history from images of experiences she does not have access to. I stood in that room and I thought about a person who had been in this facility since 1961. Who was, if still living, in their late 80s or 90s. Who still had the clothes they had arrived in, laundered and folded on a shelf. Who had read those books until the spines gave way. I climbed back up. I found Signa outside, running evening photogrammetry on the harbor infrastructure. The light was the flat gray of an Arctic spring evening, which in late April here means illuminated and colorless and long. I stood next to her and watched her work. "Did Edvard brief you?" I asked. He told me there was a classified residential program on site and that we should complete the survey and not seek contact with site personnel. She paused her scan. Did you go back down? Yes. And there are 4 residents. At least one of them has been here since approximately 1961. She lowered her scanner. She looked at the harbor ice. 64 years, she said. Approximately. In that room. I did not say anything. The wind was very low now, and the harbor was absolutely still, and the ice made no sound. What's wrong with them? She asked. What were they admitted for? Edvard says he doesn't have that information. Do you believe him? I thought about this carefully. I believe he was told not to have that information. I think the distinction matters. She picked up her scanner and resumed the transect. After a moment she said, "What do we do?" This was the question I had been trying not to arrive at since the moment I had found the warm radiator. I had been building toward it through every observation, every layer of evidence, every conversation, because that is how my mind works, and I cannot change the architecture of how my mind works, even when I know where it is taking me. What do we do? I told her I would think about it and went back inside. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my sleeping equipment in the processing facility, and I ran the problem through every framing I could construct. The operational framing. We had been sent to survey a site under false or incomplete pretenses. The survey itself was legitimate. The structural documentation was needed. The ventilation remediation was a genuine requirement. We were being used to generate paperwork that would support a classified program without being told we were doing so. This was a misrepresentation of our assignment's context, not its content. Our output would be accurate. The legal framing, a classified federal welfare program with a 65-year history, administered by a legitimate government directorate, operating under provisions that Edvard claimed authorized long-term voluntary residential placement. Whether those provisions were currently legal, whether they could legally apply to individuals admitted in 1961, whether the legal framework had ever been reviewed, I did not know these things. The human framing. There was a person in a room 4 meters below me who had been in that room for 64 years, who had arrived as a young adult and who was now, if alive, very old, who had never, in 64 years, apparently left, whose clothes from arrival were still on the shelf. This was the frame I could not process neutrally. This was where Petra kept appearing without my permission, and I understood now what the connection was. It was not grief. It was the specific quality of a life being kept at a distance from itself, Petra building her history from photographs of experiences she cannot reach, and whoever was in that 4th room folding and refolding the clothes of a person they used to be. At some point in the middle of the night, I became aware of a sound. It was faint. It came from beneath the floor of the processing facility, which shared a foundation slab with the housing block. A low, irregular rhythmic sound that was not mechanical. I lay still and listened to it for a long time before I understood what I was hearing. Someone was walking. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving in a regular pattern, back and forth. I could not determine the direction, The acoustics of the concrete slab diffused it. But the pace was the pace of a person making a short return journey. 4 or 5 steps in one direction, 4 or 5 steps back. The way a person walks when the space they have been given is very small. I did not move. I listened to it until it stopped, and then until I was certain it had stopped, and then for a further period I could not measure. At some point before dawn, I fell asleep without deciding to. In the morning I told Edvard I needed to understand the remit of our documentation. He said, "Complete structural geospatial survey of all surface structures, foundation perimeter, and subsurface access infrastructure." The deliverable is a full spatial dataset for remediation planning. I said, "The subsurface residential facility. Is it included in the remediation scope?" He said, "The ventilation infrastructure is. The residential facility itself is outside the survey scope." I said, "So we document the structure around the people. We don't document the people." He said, "Correct." I said, "And the survey documentation, will it show the subsurface chamber?" He was quiet. "Edvard, my spatial dataset will include the GPR data. The GPR data shows a 15 by 20 meter subsurface structure directly beneath the housing block. If I submit an accurate dataset, the chamber is in it. The GPR data is flagged as classified infrastructure in the briefing addendum." I didn't receive the briefing addendum. I'm giving it to you now. I looked at him. He was not comfortable with this conversation. I did not think he was a bad person. I thought he was a person who had been inside a system for long enough that the system's logic had become his native language. If I flagged the GPR data as classified infrastructure, I said, "What happens to it?" "It's transmitted separately, to a different receiving body. It doesn't appear in the public documentation record. And the survey I produce, the one that goes into the decommissioning file, is accurate except for the omission of the subsurface chamber. It documents what it's scoped to document. Which is not everything I've found." He said, "Dara, this program has been running for 65 years. It has been reviewed and reauthorized by 4 successive government bodies. The people in that facility are cared for. The medical infrastructure is maintained. The provisions are current. Whether any individual should have been admitted, or should be permitted to leave, those questions are above my authority and yours. Does anyone know they're here? Family." He said, "The program's admissions process in the early period included notification provisions. Whether families were told depends on individual cases I don't have access to." "Early period," I said. "Meaning now?" He said, "The program has been closed to new admissions since 1987. I sat with that number. 1987. Which meant the 4 people currently in residence had all been admitted before 1987 at the latest. The 4th room's resident, the one with the 1957 books and the mid-century clothing, had been there for at least 64 years. The most recently admitted person had been there for at least 38 years. I asked him what happened when a resident died. He said, The program has administrative provisions for that. I asked him what those provisions were. He said he didn't know the detail. I said, "Are they documented as deceased in any public record?" He did not answer this. I said, "Edvard, if someone was admitted to this program in 1961, are they documented as alive in any public record?" He said, "The program's participants are classified. Their status is not reflected in public records in either direction." I heard what he meant. I held it. Not documented as alive. Not documented as deceased. Documents that covered 65 years of a person's life. A life of footsteps in a small room and worn book spines and laundered mid-century clothes, reduced to an administrative classification that rendered them neither living nor dead to the outside world. Someone who had been 25 in 1961 was 89 today. Assuming they were still alive. They were not, in any formal sense, anything. They existed only inside this chamber, inside this program, inside this silence. I thought about Roald then. His earlier sight. His careful blankness. I went to find him. He was running a secondary GPR pass along the utility structure. I waited until he had finished the transect, and then I stood in front of him and I said, "Tell me about the other site." He looked at me for a long time. The flat light made his face difficult to read, which may have been the point. "It was a residential program," he said. "Similar administrative structure. A different geographic region. I surveyed the surface infrastructure for a remediation project." "Did you submit the GPR data under classified flag?" "Yes." "Did you complete the survey?" "Yes." I asked him how many residents there had been at his previous site. He said 9. How long had they been there? He looked past me, toward the harbor. The oldest admission was 1953. A person admitted in 1953 would be, if still alive, in their 90s or past them. Would have entered as a young adult in the year Stalin died, the year the Korean War ended, the year Clinton was born. Had lived every subsequent year, the moon landing, the fall of the wall, the turn of the millennium, 2 decades of the 21st century, in a chamber under an officially abandoned site, documented as nothing. How many sites are there? I asked. He said, "I don't know." Rolled. I genuinely don't know. I was told my previous assignment was unusual. I was told this was a separate program with a separate administrative lineage. I don't know if that's true. I asked him why he had agreed to come back. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because if I didn't come, someone else would. And at least I knew what I was walking into." This was either the logic of a man who had made peace with something he shouldn't have made peace with, or the logic of a man who had found the least bad option available to him and was living inside it. I did not know which. I am not sure it matters. Both things can be true simultaneously. I have been carrying the private knowledge of that for the past 6 weeks, and I am not closer to resolving it. The decision I had to make was this. I could complete the survey as scoped, accurate surface documentation, GPR data flagged and transmitted separately under classified provision, and produce a deliverable that would support the ventilation remediation, ensuring that the 4 people in the chamber below continued to receive adequate air circulation and therefore continued to survive. My output would be technically accurate. My professional documentation would be legitimate. The program would continue. Or I could produce an accurate and complete survey, including full GPR data in the primary deliverable, with a notation flagging the active subsurface residential installation as an undisclosed element of the site requiring independent regulatory review. This would almost certainly result in the survey being quarantined, my contract being terminated, and a formal investigation being opened into the disclosure. Whether that investigation would result in the program being exposed or simply reclassified was not something I could predict. What I could predict with reasonable confidence was that the ventilation remediation, the only reason anyone had any interest in our being here, would be delayed indefinitely while the disclosure was processed. The 4 residents would continue breathing recycled air through portable units that were already, according to Edvard's earlier briefing, inadequate. The person in room 4, who had been here since 1961, was in their late 80s at minimum and receiving medical care in a 4-degree pharmaceutical cabinet and the attention of a rotating care team that navigated the hatch in the floor of the cooking facility. This person had, by any reasonable measure, no life to return to, no family waiting with current knowledge of their existence, no public identity to reclaim. Whether this person wanted to be found, or wanted to remain in the only world they had known for 64 years, I did not know and had no way of knowing. I am a cartographer. I measure things and report them accurately. That is the foundational principle of my professional identity, and the thing I have always believed separated my work from the kind of work that harms people. Accurate maps save lives. Inaccurate maps lose them. I have always known which side of that line I was on. Standing in that Arctic morning, I understood for the first time that it was possible to produce a map that was accurate in every particular and still wrong in the way that mattered most, and that it was also possible to produce a map that was technically incomplete and still be doing the only thing that kept 4 people breathing. I produced the survey. I flagged the GPR data as classified infrastructure per the briefing addendum. I submitted a surface structural dataset of complete accuracy and appropriate scope. I wrote no annotations. I filed no supplementary disclosures. I sent the dataset to the Directorate of Mining, and I did not send a copy to anyone else. We flew out of Longyearbyen on the morning of the 5th day. On the flight back I kept thinking about the photograph. 8 people in front of the housing block in 1961. 8 names in pencil in the corner. I had photographed it at full resolution. The image was on my camera's memory card, which was in my jacket pocket, which was under the seat in front of me. When we landed in Oslo, I went to the airport bathroom and I sat in a stall with my camera and I looked at the photograph for a long time. The 8 faces. The penciled names. I thought about what it would mean to take those 8 names and run them against public records. To find out how many of the 8 were documented as deceased, and how many had simply disappeared from all records at some point after 1961. To find out whether any of them had family members who were still alive and who had spent 60 years not knowing. I took the memory card out of the camera. I held it in my fingers. It is 3 millimeters by 2 centimeters. It contains 3 days of photogrammetry data and 1 image of a photograph of 8 people in 1961. I put it back in the camera. I did this because I am not brave enough to do the other thing, and because I am not certain the other thing is right, and because I cannot clearly distinguish between those two explanations, and because the inability to distinguish between them is something I will carry for the rest of my career and possibly the rest of my life. I do not have the comfort of having done nothing. I also do not have the comfort of having done enough. 2 weeks after I returned to my desk, I received the contract completion paperwork from the Directorate of Mining. The spatial dataset had been accepted. The remediation planning process had been initiated. I signed the completion forms and filed them. I called Petra that evening. She answered on the second ring, which she does not always do. We talked for 40 minutes about her school, and a book she was reading, and a trip she wanted to take with her class in the summer. Her voice has a quality of attentiveness that I did not give her and which she did not learn from me, a generous patience when she is listening to someone, a stillness that makes you feel fully heard. I do not know where she got it. I am grateful every time I encounter it. After we hung up, I sat for a while in my kitchen with the light on. I have done 6 field deployments since Culver. I have completed each one accurately and professionally. I have not contacted the Directorate of Mining outside of standard project correspondence. I have not searched public records for 8 names from a 1961 photograph. I have not spoken to Rold, who has not been in contact, or to Signa, who sent me a brief professional message 3 weeks after the deployment and has not sent another. Edvard sent me a single email approximately a month after our return. It contained no text. It contained a single document, the briefing addendum I had not received before the deployment, now marked as received and acknowledged, with my name on it and a timestamp that predated our arrival at Culver. I looked at that document for a long time. Then I filed it in the project folder, where it sits behind the completion forms and the dataset submission confirmation and the contract, and where it will remain for as long as the project folder exists, accurately documenting a version of events in which I was fully briefed and knowingly compliant from the beginning. I think about the footsteps sometimes. The slow return journey in the dark. 4 or 5 steps and then 4 or 5 steps back over and over, in a room that someone has had 64 years to memorize. I think about the worn books. I think about the photograph and the 8 names I have not searched for and have not forgotten. I drew the coastline correctly. Every gradient, every structure, every measured distance. The document is accurate. The document is accurate, and it is part of the silence, and I made it, and I signed it, and my name is on it, and I go to work every day and do the same job I have always done, and I am very good at it, and I will continue to be.